So today, we're going to trace the incredible, century-long story of India's labor movement. It's a huge journey, right? From the smoke-filled mills of the colonial era all the way to the digital workplaces of today. Let's dive in.
So, let's start with a big question. How are movements even born? You know, the answer usually isn't in some grand manifesto or a single stroke of genius. Nope. More often than not, world-changing movements start with something way more basic: shared hardship.
All right, so let's set the scene. Our story kicks off way back in the 19th century. Under British colonial rule, India was going through this massive change. The rise of modern industry created something completely new on the subcontinent, a formal working class. So you've got this promise, this grand vision, right? We're talking modern factories, new railways, bustling ports in cities like Bombay and Calcutta, all promising economic progress. But, and this is the crucial part, the reality for the workers, a totally different story. We're talking brutally low wages, grueling, endless hours, and absolutely zero legal protection. None.
And just so we're clear on how bad things were, these conditions were just brutal. On the plantations, you had workers who were basically bonded laborers, trapped in a cycle of debt they could never, ever escape. And in the textile mills or on the docks, you're looking at minimal pay for just back-breaking work. So the workforce was scattered, unorganized, completely vulnerable. You can just feel the pressure building, right? It wasn't a question of if things would change, but when.
Okay, so you have all this simmering discontent. How does that actually turn into a real movement? Well, it starts with these first stirrings, moving from just, individual complaints to a real shared struggle.
And what's so important to get is that this movement didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It was a slow burn. You see the first organized efforts popping up in the late 1800s, but then something really critical happens. Big national movements like the Swadeshi and non-cooperation movements, they start linking the fight for workers' rights with the bigger fight for independence. That was a game changer.
And all of this, it's all building to this critical turning point. A moment where all these separate struggles finally come together, forged into a formal movement by what was really a perfect storm of events, both at home and around the world.
So what was the first big push? It was global, World War I. The war triggered massive inflation, right? So the cost of everything, food, clothes, you name it, it just shot through the roof. But for the workers, guess what? Their wages stayed exactly the same. That economic squeeze created this sense of urgency that you just couldn't ignore anymore.
Then you get this huge ideological spark. The 1917 Russian Revolution. This sent shockwaves across the entire planet, inspiring working-class movements everywhere. For Indian workers, it was proof that a different future was actually possible. It really emboldened them to start demanding their rights.
And then, get this, just 2 years later, in 1919, the International Labor Organization, the ILO, is established. This was huge. Why? Because it suddenly created a global standard for labor rights. It gave this powerful international legitimacy to what workers in India were fighting for.
Meanwhile, back in India, the momentum was really picking up. You have socialist and communist ideas gaining a lot of ground, and then in 1922, the Indian National Congress officially gives its members the green light to jump into union activities. This was so important because it brought in these really prominent leaders who knew how to organize and could really amplify the workers' cause.
So, you've got all this momentum. The next logical step? You have to turn all that protest into actual, real power. And how do you do that? You get it written into the law.
And that's exactly what led to the Trade Unions Act of 1926. And let me tell you, this was a truly landmark piece of legislation. It basically took unions from being these informal, sometimes illegal protest groups and turned them into legally recognized organizations with actual rights and protections.
So what did this act actually do? Well, it had 4 main goals. First, obviously, to grant that legal status. Second, to protect the rights of workers. Third, it laid out the rules of the game, what was legal and what wasn't. And fourth, it was all about promoting collective bargaining as a way to solve disputes peacefully. It created a real solid framework for organized labor to work within.
And that foundation just got stronger. Right after independence, you get the Industrial Disputes Act of 1947, which pretty much cemented the union's role as the official voice for workers in any kind of dispute.
All right, so that's the history. Let's fast forward to the modern era. The fight, it looks a little different today, but that core purpose of a union, it's still there, just facing a whole new set of 21st century challenges.
So what's driving union growth today? Well, if you look at the numbers, the number one reason, sitting at 35%, is still labor exploitation. That fundamental struggle is absolutely still at the heart of it. But you can also see that legislative support and political influence play huge roles. It just shows how deeply connected unions are to the political system. And what's really interesting is that new kinds of jobs, like in the gig economy, are becoming a bigger and bigger reason for people to unionize.
And this right here is such a powerful way to look at it. The battlefield has changed, but the war is kind of the same. Yesterday's fight against bonded labor on a plantation has just evolved into today's fight for rights in the super precarious gig economy. The exploitation on the factory floor, now you see it reflected in the vulnerability of contract work and informal labor.
So to deal with all this, unions have had to get smart and adapt. They're teaming up with global labor organizations to take on massive multinational corporations. They're using technology, simple messaging apps, to organize protests and strikes faster than ever. And their focus is getting broader too. It's not just about wages anymore. They're advocating for bigger social issues, like decent healthcare and housing. They are constantly evolving because they have to stay relevant in this modern, globalized economy.
When you step back and look at this whole century-long journey, this quote really sums it up perfectly. The shift from just scattered, unorganized protests to these structured, legally recognized organizations, that has been absolutely crucial in winning better conditions and protecting the rights of millions and millions of workers across India.
So that leaves us with one final big question to chew on. In an age of AI, remote work, and this ever-expanding gig economy, the very idea of what work is changing right in front of our eyes. So what does that mean for the future of worker power? What's the future of collective action? Definitely something to think about. Thanks so much for joining me.